Go ahead and get started. But before we do, we're running out of time before turnaround. So if there's any bill introductions in the audience or from the committee, I think we might have one actually.
I haven't got your comments back yet.
Okay. Oh, I thought I sent it back. Okay. Okay. If you want to introduce, it's fine. Okay, very good. For anybody watching online today, we have informational briefings from our nuclear community. We have two different people who are going to testify today, and we'll introduce them here in a second. But for those of you watching online, go to kansaslegislature.org, ks.legislature.org, navigate to the committees tab, standing committees, and look for the Senate committees. The utilities is on the second page. And then from there, you go to the standing committees, Senate. Let me just follow along with you so I don't tell you the wrong thing. Look for the committee documents, or committee testimony, rather. It'll give you a click date. You click in there. Sometimes you have to click several times. And then once the date highlights, and you can click on there and see the presentation. So we're going to start off today with first an informational briefing on operations from Cleve Reasoner, from the Chief Nuclear Officer out at Wolf Creek Nuclear Generating Station down in my hometown in Burlington, Kansas. So I'll turn it over to Cleve.
All right, thank you, Chairman Thompson and members of the committee. Certainly pleased to be here. I'm Cleve Reasoner. I'm the Chief Nuclear Officer at Wolf Creek, and typically, I think when people hear nuclear, they first think of the technology, and it certainly is a special thing, but I think it's appropriate to acknowledge that we're really a people business and 365, 24/7 kind of thing. So it's appropriate to acknowledge the staff and the high performance of our team, and I'm proud and humbled to represent them here today. As we work through the information here, you get familiar with, all right, that worked. Looking at the station at a glance, 1,200 megawatt plant, that's a little larger than probably the average nuclear plant, typically more of 1,000 megawatt plant. So a bit of economies of scale advantage for us there. As you said, located about 60 miles south of here in Coffee County, near Burlington, Kansas. We've been operational since 1985. That means producing commercial power. Originally licensed for 40 years, we have since gotten an extension to that license to operate out until 2045. And as we approach that time, we will again re-question whether we ought to go for another extension. An additional 20-year extension would be a similar process to the one we've gone through before. And fundamentally, what you're doing there is validating that from a forward look perspective that the integrity of the plant is still there and safety will be maintained. Basic question. So our plan is a Westinghouse 4-loop, and I like to compare that to, you have Ford, Chevy, Dodge kind of thing. So you have a Westinghouse. There are General Electric and other designs in the industry, but ours is a 4-loop Westinghouse. 4-loop meaning there are 4 pumps associated with the reactor. It's a good plant, very good design, well constructed, and has been well maintained by our owners and station personnel through the years. So the integrity of the plant is very sound. To testament to that, in 2017, we set a record for production. Didn't have an outage that year and ran very well. So the plant is still setting records, even though it's been in service now for many years. Our ownership, we are 94% Evergy, 6% KEPCO, and KEPCO's associated 16 cooperatives. One of the unique things about nuclear power, and it's an important point I think to make, is it's a little different than others. Certainly they're all unique, but for us, we load, generally speaking, 18 months worth of fuel into the reactor, and when we're doing our maintenance, and then we would like to run for 500 days or 18 months straight. What that means is, if you think about it, you've put all the energy in, and then it's our responsibility to safely meter it out over the course of time. So when we have issues like the storm of the cold weather event last year, we were able to run continuously normal operations, and the plant ran very well, and our station personnel did very well. But we wouldn't have to deal with things like fuel logistics, because all of our energy is already in the core. So if you couldn't get trucks down the road, that's not a challenge for us. So the diversity is the key in situations like that. That's one advantage that we have in our particular source of power. So just by the numbers there, you can see I said pretty large plant. So 18.5% of our of the generated electricity in the state, and almost a third of the carbon-free electricity generated. Certainly carbon-free is a hot topic in many regards now, certainly windmill and solar and so forth. I don't think people's first thought is that nuclear's been doing that for decades now. And it's appropriate to acknowledge and recognize that contribution. As mentioned, both with the Evergy territory and with the broad-reaching rural KEPCO territory, we touch 89 counties in the state. So really most of the state is affected by our business. We have 800 full-time employees or thereabouts, highly skilled engineers, skilled craft, skilled operators and so forth, some specialties like radiation protection personnel and nuclear security, for example, are unique. So good jobs, and we have an outstanding staff that works at the station. Some of the economic stuff you can see there, $46 million in property taxes and a 2016 reference point from Nuclear Energy Institute on economic benefit of $165 million. So I ask you to kind of strap your engineering hat on for a minute, and we'll talk about kind of how the plant works. So if you notice to the left of the presentation, the area there that's yellow and orange, that is represents the water that cycles through the reactor. And if you think about it here, cycling, or if this actually works here, I want to try something. No. I was going to see if the animation would work, but not in this case. So if you think about that circling in a clockwise fashion, and what's happening is the water passes through the reactor and picks up 50 degrees of heat, cycles through the steam generator just to the right, gives up that 50 degrees of heat energy, which then causes steam to be created and flow out the top of the steam generators, spins a turbine, which spins the generator, makes electricity. So basically, we pump water in a circle, make steam, and spin a generator. What's unique is the heat source is the nuclear reaction. Kind of an internal glance into the plant there. If you'll notice in the picture, the bottom center, you can see in white there is the upper torso of an individual. Just behind them, you can see kind of a half circle, dark colored half circle there. That's actually the reactor vessel. So this is during the outage, refueling outage. The top of the reactor has been taken off and fuel is being moved in and out of the reactor. The blue there that you see is water that covers that. The fuel is maintained underwater all the time. It's at the plant until recently, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. That's for shielding personnel safety. Just behind that, you can see a yellow framework. That is a trolley crane that drives back and forth and moves the fuel around. Just to the left of that, you can see kind of yellow magenta tall structure there. That's actually the reactor head that would be placed on top. View of the industry. This is a Nuclear Regulatory Commission map showing the plants in the United States. The colors on there indicated blue, orange, and red and so forth there are just regional areas of coverage for the NRC. For example, we're in Region 4 out of Arlington, Texas, so that's the blue plants on the map. So color is not tremendously important in terms of this presentation. Just wanted to show you where the distribution of plants are. Currently licensed operator are 93 plants. About 10% of the plants have closed in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years time frame. So some of the older plants and economic challenges that they've faced have driven them to close. We work closely with the NRC on a daily basis. They have resident inspectors that work at our station, and for the most part can see anything they want to see anytime they want to see it, and doing their regulatory duties and ensuring the safety of the public is maintained. And we certainly work closely with them and share that goal as well. In the previous discussion on the plant configuration, the equipment that wasn't shown there was the safety systems. Those systems sit and monitor the status of the reactor all the time. Typically, in most cases, don't actually operate on a daily basis. But if there's a change in parameter as prescribed, they would actuate and start flowing water, provide power, whatever the function might be. And because we need one as a redundancy, we will have at least 2, in some cases 3 of those. And from a diversity perspective, they'll be in different parts of the room so that if you have some event that affects one room, it won't affect the function of both pumps. Fundamental design requirements standard in the industry. In addition, since we don't necessarily have to run that equipment on a daily basis, we test it to make sure there's not something that's gone wrong. So on any given day, there are tests being run, validation that all equipment is there and functions are able to be maintained. In the last 10 years, we've added something we call flex equipment in response to the tsunami in Japan in 2011. We reviewed all of our position on safety and made some changes. I have personally been to the control room at Fukushima Daiichi and seen that event up close to make sure I have the right perspective on safety. As part of the response to that, we have in a sense installed like RV park connectors on the side of our plant so you can plug in water, power, and so forth. And we have all that equipment staged separate from the plant. So if there's some event, whatever event it might be, we think we've thought of everything. We know we've thought of everything. Let me say it right. We know we've thought of everything. This is about what if something you couldn't think of. So you get deep into scenarios here. But the reality is that's another layer of safety for us, and we could go grab that equipment and bring it to the plant. In addition, we've partnered with the rest of the industry and have additional equipment staged in Phoenix and in Memphis, and that could be readily flown to our station and dropped at our station if the case might present itself. I probably should have mentioned earlier that within the industry, if you think about that map, it's very unique. We are very collaborative in the industry because if there's an issue at one plant, it reflects poorly on all of us. So we are very much partnered together. I know all of my counterparts in the industry and can call them and get assistance and provide assistance at any time. We are required to share information. So if I learn something, I would share it with another plant, our sister plant in Missouri, for example, would absolutely be sharing that information so they can take advantage of it. We're all making sure that we continuously drive towards excellence to ensure the safety margins are absolutely maximized. Along those lines, emergency preparedness, we are required to have an emergency response plan and drill those plans working with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, FEMA, and also with the state. We do numerous drills during the year, and those are graded every 2 years. We take those very seriously, and I would say very active with the state ongoing. You can see we do 4 to 8 drills per year, so the proficiencies level is very high. Those are very unique scenarios, challenging scenarios, and we, in a sense, are driving our organization to continue to fail to survive because you have to take them to the nth step of the challenge. So very realistic and a high degree of engagement from our station personnel. While certainly there's not a high probability of that, if it had ever occurred, we would expect people to execute in that moment because they're trained, they're skilled, and their proficiency is high. So lastly, we have just in the last couple of weeks, for the first time in the plant life, moved our used fuel into a dry fuel storage facility. So the original plan was that the Department of Energy would come get the used fuel from the plant. That hasn't happened. So our storage capability eventually starts running thin on capability to store additional fuel. And the fuel itself is very depleted from the 1980s. So we're able to move it to just an air-cooled outside facility. So you can see in these pictures here on the left, the cask is being loaded into the pool. And in the picture on the right, if you notice that individual is guiding a rod that's going down into the water there. And if you look near the bottom of that rod, you can see kind of a squared piece there that's going in. That is actually a nuclear fuel assembly. That's the first assembly that's been loaded out of the plant now in the plant life. That just happened, like I said, a couple of weeks ago. The cask, ultimately a lid is welded onto the top. It's taken outside in that cart that you can see and inserted into the concrete matrix bunker there. Lastly, cybersecurity. As you may be aware, in 2017, we had an incursion on our business side network. Business side, plant side are kept separate from a network perspective, so there was no harm associated with that issue. All dealt with, and our systems are fundamentally designed so it can't get into the plant. Essentially, you can communicate information out, but you can't information in. So a nice, clear dividing line there, if you will. Having said that, I have no desire to embolden someone to continue to try to test those parameters. We are required by regulation to have a strategy for cyber and addresses these safety functions, reactor controls, and security and emergency preparedness, key functions for us to maintain. So specific regulations around those, we have made associated changes with that and since been inspected and are fully compliant with all the cyber regulations. That completes my presentation. I'll stand for questions now or whenever you choose.
I think we'll go ahead and open it up for questions before we have the next presentation. Committee, do you have any? Senator Olson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Going back to your earlier arrangement there of showing the picture where the control piece. My understanding over in Japan, when that reactor, like whatever it did, we'll say it like that, the pump didn't have power, and I'm guessing that's what you alluded to. Now you can bring in small power units. My understanding there was actually 2 separate reactors and over there, and they both had the same problem. They'd lost power, but one plant manager ran wires over the ground for about 8 miles and got the power back up, but the other one didn't.
That's right.
So have we fully looked at all the different kinds of redundancy? So if that situation happens, it sounds like you have, but I mean, to me, it sounds, like you've taken the situation over there and tried to apply and improve our situation. So.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So fundamentally what happened at that plant, huge tsunami, so extreme event. And the nature of that plant design was not one that could withstand water on the plant site. Some plants can, some plants can't. This one couldn't. And as it turns out, the ones that can are sort of built like a ship sitting on land. So you have to kind of go up and over and down to get into the plant. This one was not. In a sense, it's sort of like a bathtub, and the safety systems were in the bottom of the bathtub. So when the water came in, it filled it in. The diesel generators were underwater and would not function. So different circumstance for us in terms of flooding. But one of the learnings from the other plant, Daiichi, was that, yes, they did run a cable across country for about 6 miles to bring power into the plant, and was the difference in damaging fuel and not. So similar to that rationale is our flex equipment. We have pumps, generators, hoses, cables stored, actually 2 sets in different locations. So if a tornado comes by and it takes out one set, it won't take out the other, it won't take out the plant. So there's a rationale there. So we could come in after whatever happens, and we have bucket trucks that can come in and sweep away fence or whatever, cars, whatever debris might be in the way, and then we can pull the trailers in and come in directly into the plant. So that's exactly what the learning was from that event.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your information and your testimony today. I was invited a couple of years ago, I think in 2019, to visit the facility, the Wolf Creek facility, and thank you very much for the opportunity to do that, and was impressed with the redundancies that we heard about and how the operations worked there. So got to see some of that firsthand. I also learned while there how much of our state that the Wolf Creek power plant does provide power to, and I can't remember what the number is, though. It used to be, 180,000 homes, or could you give us that information again?
I know that one off the top of our head. I don't remember what the exact number is, but we'll find that out. We have that on a fact sheet.
Well, thank you, and I thought it was impressive to hear that, we have a relatively small footprint of the facility,
Right.
and to generate that much energy in a clean, efficient manner. Again, we have those safety redundancies in place if there's an emergency, and you practice those a couple times a year, which I appreciate also. And I see that the plant is scheduled to be decommissioned in 2045. Did you talk about, I'm sorry I arrived a few minutes past the beginning of your talk, did you talk about, is there a plan you're aware of for Kansas to kind of make up for the energy that's not going to be generated at this power plant as of 2045, where we can fill that in from?
Yeah, I'll start like this. First of all, we would question whether we should license the plant for a time beyond that, which certainly is possible. We'll go through a review that was comparable to what we did to extend for the first 20
So it
years.
might be extended, and that would be
Could
up
be.
to KCC, or who would extend that?
It goes to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission because they own the license. There's probably
So
public
NERC.
meetings associated. I know there are public meetings associated with that, so other interested parties could be involved in that. Beyond that option, you're really into long-range resource planning, which is not my expertise. But we will talk about some of the possibilities that are out there in those long-term timeframes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And I'm sorry, one of the other pieces of data in there was 20% of the power in the state about is produced at the plant. So to give you that perspective on households.
Senator Peterson.
Hey, Mr. Chair, do you know if Evergy still has a person cleared to participate with the Fusion Center?
And by Fusion Center, you mean the Cyber Center?
This Fusion Center down there for Department of Emergency Management? I'm getting a head nod yes from Laura, so
Okay.
just
I'm
want
gonna
to make
go
sure
with their
you're
answer.
still there.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation. I might have missed what you said about the spent fuel rods, but I had a couple questions about that.
Sure.
Are all of the fuel rods that we have used since we started Wolf Creek still on site?
They are.
And I'm assuming in your slide, the federal repository, and I assume that's at Yucca Mountain, was
Yes, sir.
not ever commissioned. So we originally had planned to send those spent fuel rods there.
That's correct.
So, and we really don't have any other option other than to keep them there. Is that correct?
Currently, that is correct.
And maybe our next presentation will talk about this. So if so, I'll wait. But and I'm telling you much more than I know, but I saw YouTube on Bill Gates in terms of the natrium thing, in terms of using old fuel rods with a sodium-based, I don't even know what I'm talking about. But anyway, a traveling wave reactor where they use those old fuel cells to, and they're doing a Wyoming plant. Is there ever a possibility that we might be able to do something like that in terms of using those spent fuel rods?
So I'm actually going to leave most of that for the next speaker. As it turns out, he's a subject matter expert in the industry, and I don't want to embarrass myself in front of him. But
You know, if I were smart, I would have asked the question in that way. But thank you.
And Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for being here. I, too, have been lucky enough to be able to visit the reactor. So my question had to do with, you talk about the refueling that happens every 18 months. Is that is that April and, I'm trying to think of what months?
yeah, you got it right. So you alternate spring of one year and fall of the next, alternating pattern like that. So you want to land it in those timeframes when the demand is lowest on the grid. So weather is mildest and so forth. So that's how that occurs. Generally, there are 40 days long as a rule of thumb, depending, of course, on nature, maybe some projects that you're implementing. And we probably don't talk about it enough, but our staff almost doubles during that time frame. We bring a lot of contract workers in to do a lot of that work during the outage. So we'll have 1,500, 1,600 people on station for a month or so.
We appreciate your timing.
Yeah.
I just have one quick one. Each time you swap out the rods, does that fill an entire one of those casks?
Not exactly. So you replace about half to a third of the rods each time. And it takes about 3 casks it takes 2.5 casks for 18 months. So simpler way to think of it is we would want to load about 5 or 6 casks every 5 years, roughly speaking.
So the storage long-term, like you said, you're taking the older rods and you're putting out into an air cool. Do you foresee the storage being a problem going forward if there's no other options?
No, not for quite a long period of time. It's very passive. They sit there, you put the lid on them, it's done. The air can readily cycle through those easily. So I don't see that as a challenge. And then the nature of how it's been constructed is we can modularly add onto it. And then in the end, they sort of have back to back. So you have a nice tornado shield kind of logic to it.
And then about the cost of fuel, is that a big issue? Because you have it on site. I mean, is the cost fluctuate when you do have to buy fuel? Is it significant fluctuations or is it pretty stable?
It's fairly stable. It has maybe some notable swings over long periods of time. We have actually developed a strategy to be forward-looking about 10 years, so we can tamp down any changes there. And of course, it's indexed and all these other ways of kind of hedging against those prices. But I would say we're for at least a decade out on some real solid pricing and very stable pricing going forward.
Good. Senator Olson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I remember when we ran the 20-year extension where you can store on site, because I think you had 40 years. And then, but it seemed like I was in the House at the time, which was a long time ago, that Chairman Holmes brought a presentation where there were actually respent take the fuel of the old facilities somewhere in New Mexico or somewhere where they had a process facility going. I don't know if that's still going today, and are they taking some of the old fuel and reprocessing? And I was
Yes.
curious.
You're right. I know what you're talking about. There's a proposed facility in New Mexico, right on the Texas-New Mexico border. Is one on the New Mexico side and one on the Texas side, with different companies that are working those facilities. As of yet, they're not accepting fuel and not reprocessing fuel, so they're still in play or being developed, would be the right way to say that.
All righty, Mr. Reasoner, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
We're going to turn to our next informational hearing then from the Nuclear Energy State of Advanced Reactors from Marcus Nickel, who's the Senior Director of the Nuclear Energy Institute. Marcus?
Right. Yep. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today. I come from the Nuclear Energy Institute. We're an industry trade association representing members in the industry on policy, regulatory matters. My title is Senior Director of New Reactors. In that role, I lead industry's efforts on advanced reactors and the regulatory policy and business conditions. I want to start just by bridging the operating reactors like Wolf Creek into the advanced reactors, because there is a bridge there. And that is that to be successful with advanced reactors, we need a foundation to build upon, and our operating reactors are that foundation. They're that foundation because the cheapest clean electricity today are continuing to operate those nuclear power plants. The cheapest nuclear energy is continuing to operate our nuclear power plants. It is also a foundation because it provides the workforce, the skills, the safety culture, and the supply chain to be able to build advanced reactors. So it's very important that we keep Wolf Creek and other operating reactors continuing to operate. I want to start by talking about the different technologies in advanced reactors, and there's two primary dimensions that we can look at them. One is in size, and the other is in the material that is used to cool the reactor. As we look at the different sizes, we have small modular reactors. Those are defined as less than 300 megawatts electric, and you can have multiple reactors at a single plant. That's the modularity. So you can add them all up front. You can add them over time as your demand increases, and that's a great way to match supply with demand. We have very small reactors. We call them microreactors, generally less than 20 megawatts, and they're ideal for more remote applications, Arctic villages, mining operations. Long-term, they could be used for microgrids, reliable and resilient power for emergency facilities, that sort of thing. We do also have some advanced reactors that are much larger in the 1,000 megawatt range, but what we find is that the market generally wants the smaller reactors. In terms of the different cooling technologies, we have light water SMRs, that's represented by NuScale in the middle of the page. Light water is the technology that we use in our operating reactors today. So those light water SMRs are building and utilizing thousands and thousands of reactor years of operation experience that they have available. The other technologies are not cooled with water. They're cooled with things like high temperature gas, that'd be helium. They're cooled with liquid metal, that might be lead or sodium. Or they're cooled with molten salt. And the molten salt are a little bit unique in that many of them don't have solid fuel inside. They have fuel dissolved into the molten salt. So it operates a little bit differently. Nonetheless, all of those technologies also have years of experience at lab scale testing, and some have a commercial operations experience, even in other countries. The other interesting thing about the non-water cooled reactors, one is that they can operate at higher temperatures. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what higher temperatures can offer. And the second is that they use still low enriched uranium, but the enrichment is higher than the current 5%. It can go up to 20%, still safe, but it's at a higher enrichment. The main advantage of that higher enrichment is that the fuel reloads can span longer periods of time. Some of those can go 10, 20 years before they have to replace the fuel. Moving on to the versatility that come with these new technologies, one of the things we're trying to do in the industry is develop, I call it a portfolio of nuclear products to be able to meet a diverse set of market and customer needs. Up till now, we have one single nuclear product, many different types of designs. We have a Westinghouse, a General Electric, but they're all 1,000 megawatts. And that 1,000 megawatts is great at what it does. It's a large base load plant. It can serve a lot of electricity. But what we see is that not everybody wants 1,000 megawatts in one location. Some companies, one, can't afford 1,000 megawatts or don't need that much power for their demand. They want 300 megawatts instead. Others say, well, I may want 1,000 megawatts, but I don't want it all in one place. I want it in different locations. So what we're seeing from the market is that says, keep the operating reactors operating, but as we build new ones, these smaller reactors meet our needs better. And then, of course, we have the micros that I talked about as well. We're also seeing that customers and markets want more than just electricity. They're recognizing that, well, yes, we want electricity, but we're also interested in hydrogen, or we're interested in using the heat directly. There's a large momentum toward decarbonizing the electric sector, and that's certainly where nuclear can contribute because we're zero carbon emitting. But we also see that there's interest in decarbonizing other energy sectors as well. The electric system is about a third of the carbon emissions for all energy sources. Transportation and heat is the other remaining. And so there are not a lot of options. In fact, there are no options today to decarbonize those. And so nuclear, being able to produce hydrogen or heat directly, offers an opportunity to do that. And with that brings many more uses for nuclear energy. Certainly electricity to homes and businesses and factories, but that heat directly or that hydrogen can go into that transportation and industrial heat processes that I talked about. The one thing that we know is of utmost importance is that we need to be affordable. One of the things that is important to know is that many times the customers are looking for the lowest cost solution. And so we have to make sure that we're developing technologies that are going to be competitive in the market. And so one of the things that being smaller offers as an advantage is that you can actually be safer and lower cost by being smaller. It's counterintuitive. The economics of size have played out over time, and that's been the going theory. So you're actually going against conventional wisdom, which is, well, if you go smaller, you're disrupting that economics. But what we find is as you go smaller, you have a smaller hazard because you have less radioactive material. But at the same time, you can make these plants simpler because now when you get smaller, you can rely on natural physics. That's gravity, natural circulation. Natural physics always works. And so what you can do when you rely on the natural physics is you can now eliminate some of the pumps and valves and piping that you need in active components. And by doing that, you are enhancing your safety and you're reducing your cost. As you look at these smaller sizes, we can design them specifically so they can utilize components that are already available in the market, pumps, valves, that sort of thing, rather than having to specially design these components for nuclear power plants, and you get some cost advantages there. And by making them smaller, you can build them in factories, more of the components in factories. So you have not only parallel manufacturing going on, so you can build faster, but you have greater control over the quality of the manufacturing processes than you do when you're in the field. Moving on to the next slide, building on this sense of clean and affordable and reliable, what we've heard from the market is that yes, there is a lot of motivation going toward zero carbon, whether it's utility commitments or policies that are pushing things in that direction. But you have to be affordable and reliable as well. And you can't just maximize one parameter, you have to maximize all three. And many customers see that the way to do that is by having a diverse portfolio of generation. And so this study was from E3. It looked at Washington State. And Washington State had recently gone from a renewables portfolio standard to a clean energy portfolio standard, getting down to zero carbon emissions. And the utility was asking, well, how do we do that affordably and reliably? And so they looked at this and they said, well, when we start to get more than 90% reduction in carbon emissions, to do it with just renewables and storage is going to cost a lot. And that's where you see the hockey stick curve go up. If we make sure we include our currently operating reactor, that's CGS or Columbia Generating Station, we do reduce the cost. But it's not until we actually add more nuclear in the form of small modular reactors that we can actually achieve these decarbonization goals, maintain reliability, and have a reasonable impact on the cost. And so it's many others are starting to come to this realization that SMRs need to be a part of the solution. When we look at the question of how do we get small modular reactors into the market, I'll talk on the next slide in terms of which projects are actually going on. There's not been one built in the United States yet. But what we know is that for almost any new technology, the first of a kind is more expensive than the lowest cost alternative in the market. And we also know that customers want to buy the lowest cost option. And so how you get these new technologies into the market is with government support to cover those first of a kind costs. And the federal government did that with renewables. The federal government is also doing that with small modular reactors. So they have cost shares for the demonstrations I'll talk about in the next slide. They have production tax credits for new nuclear, loan guarantees, and power purchase agreements that can be utilized. We're also seeing interest in the states. I have a future slide on some more specifics, but in a number of areas where states are interested in putting forward policies to help this new technology get into the market, whether it's tax incentives for the first projects or even manufacturing, or if it's just building the infrastructure, whether it's training programs at community college for the skills that are going to be needed for the workers at the plants. This is a slide of the current status of demonstrations. We expect about 8 plants to be operational by the end of this decade. Various designs are in here. The NuScale, TerraPower, X-Energy are all being funded by Department of Energy, so they have government cost shares related to them. The interesting thing about all of those, the X-Energy shows Energy Northwest, but Grant County is going to be the off-taker on that. All 3 of the utilities that are developing those projects have never owned nuclear before. And so that's the great thing about the smaller reactors. I talked about the smaller size, but there's a lower capital cost. 1,000 megawatts is very difficult for most utilities to be able to put on their balance sheet. 300 megawatts is much easier for those utilities. And so we're seeing utilities that have never had an ability to purchase nuclear pursue that. The last slide I want to cover is in state and utility interest. There has been growing interest both at the state and utility level over the past few years. This is just a sampling of some of the bills that have been passed, but just to give an example of the range of state activity. In Montana just last year, they passed 2 bills. One was a repeal of the moratorium on building new nuclear, and so by repealing that, now new nuclear can be built in the state. The second was a study bill, and so the Montana State Legislature right now is studying the feasibility of using SMRs in Montana. Specifically, they're looking at a SMR as a replacement for Colstrip, a large coal plant in Montana that's scheduled to be retired. And they're very concerned about the consequences to both lost jobs and economic benefits to the area. Nebraska is another example that they passed a bill last year to enable SMRs to utilize tax incentives that are available for other clean energy projects. And so SMRs could be used for that. And so that's sort of a sampling of some of this legislative work. Utility action has also been in a range of things. Some utilities are just out there understanding what SMR technology is, whether it might be a potential benefit to them down the road. Others have included it in their integrated resource planning, and others still have actually started to embark on actual projects to build in the near term. So there's a range of things that companies have done. With that, I'd be happy to take questions.
I can't imagine anybody's going to have any questions for you, Mark. Thanks very much. No, committee, open it up to questions. Senator Hawk.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I make another stab at the question I asked Mr. Reasoner? Is there a reason, an advantage to using spent fuel rods? I read that the Bill Gates one in Wyoming, the TerraPower, I think used spent fuel rods. Is that true? And how big a percent of the cost is the fuel rods? Maybe that's not an efficient way to do it. So could you speak about that particular technology and if that applies to some of the other technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'd love to answer that question. So the ability to recycle used fuel, to begin, when the fuel is finished from the reactor, it generally goes through 3 cycles. So the fuel has been in our current reactors for about 4.5 years, and it has used about 4% of the total energy within that fuel. 96% of the energy still remains, and so it's actually a resource there. There's tremendous value still left in that. We don't recycle in the United States today because of economics. It's just the price of uranium is so low today that it's cheaper to mine new uranium, enrich that, rather than take the used fuel and try to recycle it and reutilize the remaining energy that's left in that. Now, with that said, I think over time there will be a point in the future where the price of new uranium is not so low and the economics for recycling start to make sense. I don't know when that may be, but I do think that someday in the future that situation would occur. So then the question becomes, for advanced reactors, and the sodium fast reactor is one that can very efficiently utilize used fuel and to burn it in there. And the natrium is a sodium reactor. So the question is, well, when does it become economic to do that because you may get better efficiencies? So just I should have said that even today's reactors can utilize recycled fuel. We've demonstrated, we call it MOX fuel, mixed oxide fuel, but we've demonstrated the ability to use MOX fuel. We just don't do it today for the reasons I stated. So when we start to look at the advanced reactors and specifically sodium fast reactors and the ability to recycle, we are working with companies that are very interested in developing the recycling capabilities and so that they can utilize that rather than utilizing this 20% fuel that I talked about because you have increased fuel cost for higher enrichments. So recycling economics start to look a little bit better. Now, they're not going to use recycling for the very first reactors. This is more long-term. Whether it's 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years down the road, I don't know. But it certainly wouldn't be the first reactors that they would look at. And, but they are looking at that. They're trying to develop both the business case and the technology to be able to pursue that. Did I answer all of the question? Yeah. Okay. Very well. Thank you.
Committee, other questions? Senator Fagg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your presentation. When I look at this map of the operating commercial nuclear power reactors in the United States, first thing that catches my eye, they're kind of all in the eastern half, not the western half. Is there any reason for that? My second question would be, when was the last nuclear power plant built in the United States?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's any reason why they're in the eastern and the western, other than that's where major population centers tend to be, so they're closer situated to major populations. That would be my best guess. I don't think there's any technical reason why they wouldn't be in the middle of the U.S. Refresh the second question again.
When was the last?
The last one. Yeah, the last one was actually, I think it was Watts Bar 2. I'll get the dates wrong, but it was in the early 2000s they completed that plant. It was started way back in the 70s or 80s, and then it was, we called it mothballed. It was sort of set aside and preserved so it could be completed later in time. So that was the last plant. And then there is a plant being built right now. Georgia Power is building it down in Georgia. It's the Vogtle 3 and 4 units.
Could you give us an estimate of cost range from these small micro reactors to, say, 1,000 megawatt reactor, what we're looking at, as opposed to saying adding a second reactor to a Wolf Creek, the standard base load? What's the cost differential there?
Yeah, it's difficult to compare the small reactors to the large reactors in terms of cost, just because we've stopped trying to track and estimate the cost of large reactors because the market's not interested in them. So we do have some reports, and we can send you links to the reports on the cost estimates of small modular reactors and microreactors versus competitive technologies. So SMRs we've compared to natural gas and renewables, and we find that what we're expecting for, we call it the nth of a kind. That's after you come down the cost curve and you don't need government support anymore and it's cost competitive, that the levelized cost of electricity is very similar to those other technologies. And we've had utilities tell us that the price is within the range that they could select an SMR just based on all of the variables they would have to consider. Microreactors are more comparable to diesel generators, just by the niche of the market that they're focused in on. And they're already cost competitive with diesel generators, even as a first of a kind.
Senator Olson.
This is really not a nuclear question, but it'd be helpful, a map of the U.S. with all the, different kinds, a map with the nuclears, the coal, I'm very familiar with Washington State, especially western part of Washington State, the Grand Coulee Dam. I've actually toured it, and there's a lot of hydro up there. A lot of people don't realize the Columbia River Basin, one of the largest in the world. It's probably bigger by a ways than than Hoover Dam. But Grand Coulee, it's big and produce a lot of power. So there's a lot of hydro up there. So I think if you had the different mixes on a map, the Midwest would probably have some coal, it'd have some hydro, and it'd have a lot of different forms there to plug in these holes that don't have nuclear. And I think that's the simple reason is like the hydro was probably at that time more reasonable cost. The nuclear, you got to have a lot of people to pay. Probably when we overbuilt, we're talking about rates right now. Well, the old West Star area, I'm guessing, had a higher rate for a reason. It was when this thing was built, they had a higher rate than the Aquila or the Kansas City Power and Light because they had to start paying for this nuclear plant. And even though it doesn't cost much to run it, it costs a lot to build it. And so you normally don't build these unless you have millions of people to pay for them. That's my guess.
Senator Hawk?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm looking at slide 8 and Montana and converting coal to nuclear. Can you reuse the turbines at a coal plant and plug in the nuclear generation, or is that a fairly simplistic idea?
No, it's so from the theoretical idea, the only difference between a coal plant and a nuclear power plant is what's creating the heat. And so coal is burning coal, nuclear is just splitting an atom. So conceptually, the rest of the plant is very similar. And there are people that have proposed, well, let's just swap out the boiler unit part of it for a nuclear power plant. And they're looking at the feasibility of that, and especially economics. Others have looked at it and said, well, it's very difficult to match up the heat requirements from the secondary side, the turbine generator set, and the heat output available from a given nuclear power plant. So they're so difficult to match up that it just makes more sense to take everything out except for transformers and switch gears and all that sort of stuff, because that's readily usable. But the balance of plants maybe start over. So there's really, it's inconclusive at this point. There's sort of two camps out there and so I think we need to wait for the studies to know. And it's probably more on a case-by-case basis. So this coal plant's heat requirements are very similar to a nuclear power plant's heat capabilities. The balance of plant is relatively young. It's still has a lot of value in it. You might keep it, whereas an older plant that you can't match up the heat, you might not do that.
Is that what they're trying to do in Montana, or is that just passed a bill to look into it? Do they have a plan to do that in Montana?
I believe that that's one of the questions that they're looking at. But even if they're not able to reuse the balance of plant from the coal plant, they're still looking at, well, can we put an SMR at this plant? A couple of the things that they're really interested in, they have a major transmission line there that has a lot of capacity. And so to reutilize that transmission infrastructure is very valuable to them. It's very difficult to build new transmission these days, and it's very expensive as well. So there is a cost savings and value there. The other thing they're looking at is, well, SMRs have similar number of jobs, similar pay grades in jobs as a coal plant. And so this is a way to preserve jobs and community economic benefits that you might not get with another technology.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Running out of time. Any one last question from anyone? Anyone? I do have one. I guess, does it face the same regulatory structure with regard to the hurdles we have with implementing new nuclear?
Yeah, so the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is still the regulator of safety and environmental impacts for SMRs. Same stringent requirements. Now, what the NRC is doing is they're looking at the new technology and saying, well, we recognize they do safety in a little bit different way, or they have this enhanced safety built on natural physics. And so let's take that into consideration. And they are going through things that would allow a site boundary emergency planning zone, or more or security that's more based on what we call security by the design, or the plant itself is protecting, rather than having to require on require or rely on a lot of manpower.
So it might take away a few hurdles in the
Yes.
future, perhaps. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Committee, thank you. Oh, before we leave, obviously with the winter storm, we're just not going to have committee meetings the rest of the week. And then we'll get to work on Monday. So check your agendas for that. And with that, we are adjourned.